I'm going to go ahead and start.
Okay.
I can't hear you.
I will tell Tamika to do the preamble, and then I'll do the 5.
Yes. Are we ready? Preamble? In a moment?
Yes, ma'am.
Four, three, two, one. The Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. As a reminder to members, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you are not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with HRES 965 and accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I will now recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we are holding a hearing on the update on COVID-19 in Africa. Thank you for attending today's hearing. COVID-19 is the first severe pandemic of the 21st century, and before COVID-19 engulfed the world, in the United States, we had become accustomed to watching dangerous outbreaks from afar. Shortly after COVID-19 was declared a pandemic, doomsday scenarios were predicted for the African continent. While Africa defied the COVID-19 nightmare scenarios, the toll of the pandemic on the continent, which has now surpassed 100,000 deaths, should not be ignored. We continue to be vigilant, especially with countries that heavily impact the continent, such as Nigeria and South Africa, where new variants have emerged. While victory cannot be claimed yet, African countries should be praised for mounting a concerted response to the pandemic. Perhaps the continent's swift response to the pandemic, moving quickly from crisis mode to response mode, is due in part to the continent's collective epidemiological know-how and the lessons learned from previous and ongoing outbreaks such as Ebola. Today, I would like our witnesses to give their assessments of Africa's COVID-19 crisis and analyze the various responses across different countries to better assess how the U.S. can effectively collaborate with specific COVID-19 recovery plans. At the onset of this pandemic, most of the continent acted swiftly and collectively to not only suppress the spread of COVID-19, but also to tackle vaccine access. This led to an African Union-led continental strategy, which included the African Vaccine Acquisition Task Team, and to ensure that the AU countries have cost-effective and equitable access to the AU-secured vaccines, the AU and Africa CDC launched the African Medical Supplies Platform. While these African-led solutions are commendable, more is needed to vaccinate the majority of the continent's population. As we focus on the vaccination stage, I can't help but note that COVID-19 vaccine distribution highlights the problems we also have here. which is resources not being equitably distributed to the poor. We must recognize that ending the pandemic is a common and shared responsibility. I was encouraged when President Biden reversed course and rejoined the World Health Organization and announced the U.S. would also join the World Health Organization's COVID-19 Vaccines Global Access COVAX facility. This signaled to the world that the U.S. is committed to equitable vaccine access and distribution worldwide, including in Africa. African countries' options to acquire vaccines are largely limited to importing them. But vaccine equity is not the only hurdle that the continent faces. Some vaccines require either ultra-cold freezers or regular freezers to keep the vaccine stable, so some vaccines will be virtually impossible to deliver in many places in Africa. With this in mind, we look forward to your suggestions on ways we can address the logistical challenges, including the cold storage requirement of some vaccines, as well as options for development and manufacturing vaccines. Beyond the vaccination stage in Africa, like the rest of the world, we will need to address secondary impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Before COVID-19, many countries in Africa were making incremental economic gains and trying to stabilize their economies. The pandemic has interrupted these gains. Also, earlier this month, this subcommittee heard how COVID-19 mitigation efforts have been used by some African governments to suppress voter turnout. In addition, children across Africa will suffer the consequences of school closures and potentially face generational educational challenges. Finally, women and girls in Africa are likely to be the hardest hit by the health and socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19. I look forward to hearing more about these issues from our distinguished witnesses. The needs are great, and the investment should not be modest. That is why today I'll be introducing a resolution calling for decisive and robust international collaboration and coordination to fight COVID-19 across Africa. I hope in a bipartisan way we will join together in this effort. Finally, my colleagues and I are interested in hearing recommendation from the witnesses regarding legislative solutions where the U.S. can partner with Africa in their COVID-19 recovery work. I believe that a renewed, strategic, respectful, and focused approach to U.S. policy toward Africa will lay the foundation for long-term, post-COVID-19 recovery. We must seize this renewed sense of urgency to create momentum around African-designed and led sustainable strategies that will increase its resilience to the next global challenge and contribute to its prosperity. I'd like to thank our witnesses for participating in this important hearing, and the committee is looking forward to hearing your recommendations on how to partner with countries in Africa. I now recognize the ranking member for the purpose of making his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Bass, and thank you for convening this very, very important hearing. In 2020, Africa had both fewer COVID-19 cases, about 3.5% of the world's caseload, according to the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and fewer deaths than other parts of the world. Robust containment and a younger population were factors, but the emergence of a variant that is now more transmissible and deadly has resulted in a fatality rate in 2021 that appears to be above the global average. Today, we will hear from an expert panel on the recent past and also on what needs to be done, including vaccine distribution to mitigate this insidious disease. I think Dr. Kenguson has put it very well in his testimony when he said that the pandemic united our continent like never before. Our response, guided by the 4 C's, communication, collaboration, coordination, and cooperation, have been fundamental to the AU's unified approach to combating COVID-19. I also hope, Madam Chair, that we can also focus on how the pandemic exacerbates other crises, in particular, the food security crisis that now grips so many countries and impacts so many people. There are serious corollary impacts on unemployment, on other unattended health issues, on education, and on food insecurity. I am glad to say that we have convened a very distinguished panel, one that includes a witness who did yeoman's work in combating the food crisis throughout the COVID pandemic, our former ambassador to the UN food agencies, Kip Tum. Having worked closely with Ambassador Tom on addressing the locust swarms in East Africa, which devastated farmers, I know that he is absolutely tireless. Representative Bass and I have introduced legislation, H.R. 1079, to better coordinate the U.S. government's response to the locust plague, which I would invite subcommittee members to join. I would especially be interested in hearing how the battle against locusts and hunger was inhibited by COVID and how that is being overcome, assuming that it is being overcome. I would also like to hear about how successful our interaction with the principal UN food agencies like the World Food Program and the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, have been in addressing hunger and how the response to COVID impacted our work with these agencies. In so many ways, food security is key. We know that vulnerable food insecure people, a number that now estimated at over 40 million in East Africa alone, are at heightened risk to succumb to disease, including COVID-19. So while we must continue focusing on combating the pandemic, I also reiterate a call that I made last July. We cannot forget the corollary crises that follow COVID, in particular, that of food insecurity caused by the desert locusts. I look forward to our discussion, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I now want to introduce our witnesses. And we definitely appreciate all of you for being here today. And let me remind you that the witnesses, that your written statements will appear in the hearing record. And so we would like for you to summarize your statement, and you all have 5 minutes to speak. Now, during this part, we are liable to be interrupted for votes. And what I would suggest, since we all vote in groups and it takes quite a long time, is that we continue the hearing, we not recess, and continue the hearing during votes. As a matter of fact, votes have started already. So let me introduce our first witness. Dr. John Kenguson currently serves as the first director of the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention. He is a leading virologist with nearly 30 years of work experience in public health. Prior to his appointment with the CDC, he was the deputy principal director of the Center for Global Health at the U.S. Center for Disease Control, and associate director of laboratory science and chief of international laboratory branch at the Division of Global HIV/AIDS and Tuberculosis. Dr. Donald Kubaraka is a Rwandan economist who is chairman and managing partner of Southbridge, a financial and investment advisory firm. He served as finance minister of Rwanda from 1997 to 2005. He sits on the board of trustees of several distinguished institutions, including the Rockefeller Foundation, the Center for Global Development, and the Brookings Institute. He also chairs the board of the Global Fund to fight HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Our final witness, Ambassador Kip Tom, served as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Agencies for Food and Agriculture and U.S. Ambassador to the Rome-based UN agencies from 2019 until 2020. Currently, Ambassador Tom is the managing member of Tom Farms, LLC, and president of CIRISERV, Incorporated, where he leads financial, strategy, and production operations. In addition to being active in agribusiness operations in Indiana for the past 30 years, the ambassador has also served as a crop production consultant to various companies in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. I welcome you all and ask that you observe the 5-minute time limit. Dr. Kenguson.
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman Bass, for the opportunity, and all other Congress women and men. And I really would like to express a sincere gratitude from the Africa CDC and African Union for offering me the opportunity to, in 5 minutes, give you the situation of the COVID-19 in Africa. First of all, Congresswoman Bass, let me just state this, that a threat of COVID anywhere in the world is a threat of COVID everywhere in the world. COVID-19 has taught us three key lessons: that we are more connected than we thought we were, that we are more vulnerable than we thought we are, and more inequities exist than we thought. As a continent, we have recorded over 4 million cases of COVID-19. Of that number, 107,000 have unfortunately died. Our case fatality ratio is at 2.7%, which is significantly higher than the global average of 2.7%. Our pandemic has a few characteristics that must be noted. We have to always assume that there's a lot of underreporting. A recent study in Nigeria, precisely in Lagos, a city of 20 million inhabitants, found out that 20% of the population had been exposed to COVID-19. So if we actually put that in real numbers, it means at least 2 million people in the city, a big city like Lagos, would have been exposed to COVID-19. The second thing is the emergence of variants. As we can heard earlier alluded to, new variants are continuing to emerge in South Africa and other places, and they're having impact on our vaccine deployment strategy. Congresswoman, let me just highlight how we have responded to this COVID response in Africa. Very early on, in February of 2020, we knew that COVID would be a threat for the continent. And when there were just 2 cases reported in Egypt on February 14, the African Union, under the leadership of His Excellency Musa Faki Mohammed, convened an emergency meeting of all ministers of health. The emergency meeting resulted in a joint African continental strategy that was underpinned by the need to cooperate, to collaborate, to communicate, and to coordinate our efforts. There were 3 goals from that strategy. One was to limit transmission of COVID as much as possible. Second was to prevent deaths. And thirdly, to prevent and limit harm. The harm here was defined more broadly, including the harm on immunization programs, harm on HIV, TB, and malaria programs that exist on the continent. And today, we now know that the impact of COVID is very severe on our HIV programs that have been supported by the President's Emergency for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, for over 15 years and more now. We developed certain tools as part of that strategy that must be highlighted. First of all, the continent launched a partnership to accelerate COVID testing and increase the testing from about 300 million in May last year to the current approximately 400 million testing. We established a partnership called that enabled us to set up the African Medical Supply Platform, which was really a partnership between the private sector led by Mr. Stripe Masiwa, who is a businessman in Africa, the African Export-Import Bank, Afri-Exim Bank, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and many others, and Africa CDC. That was a shared demonstration of the power of innovation and the power of partnership with the private sector. The President Ramaphosa, in his capacity as the chair of the African Union at that time last year, launched an initiative called the African Vaccine Acquisition Task Team to secure more vaccines. And we have since then, through that platform, secured an additional 270 million doses of vaccines to immunize our population and complement the efforts of the Covet, which is a multilateral facility set up by the
Dr. Kubaraka.
Thank you, Chair, Congresswoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, members of the subcommittee, good morning. Thank you for your time. My name is Kubaraka. I speak in a triple capacity as one of the 5 special envoy of the African Union on COVID and member of the African Vaccine Acquisition Task Team. But I'm also the chair of the board of the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, malaria, which has the very strong support of the United States and has been deeply involved in the response to COVID. And I would like at the outset to express my deep appreciation for Congress for the recent support through the American Recovery Plan, which will enable the Global Fund to play its role. My colleague John has spoken about the pandemic. I want to stick to the economic impact of COVID. What has been the impact of the economic shock on Africa? What does it take to get out of there? What is Africa doing itself? And what can we do together with the US? So my first point, since 2000, Africa had been actually beginning to converge with the rest of the world. The global financial crisis was a setback, but economic protection buffers at the time were very strong. The means available to resist were there. By the time of COVID, the ability to protect our countries against economic shocks were weaker. I do agree that there were some serious issues even before COVID. Inequalities, limited inclusion, jobs, creeping debt in some countries. But the economic shock has accelerated the damage. Africa has suffered not so much from the pandemic as in the fatalities, but the economic consequences of responding to the pandemic. I would like to add that low-income countries, unlike wealthy countries, did not have the financial capacity to respond. Wealthy countries have pulled out massive stimulus equal to about $17 trillion, something obviously not available to African low-income countries. To give you an idea, according to the IMF, high-income countries have provided stimulus equal to 24% of their GDP. The emerging markets, about 6% of their GDP. Low-income countries, less than 2% of their GDP. And so, how do we get out of this? The most important issue now, as John has said, is to access and fund and roll out the vaccines. It is the only way to kickstart our economies back to life. Lockdowns in the context of economies with large informal sectors are no longer feasible as a long-term solution, not the least because of limited ability to provide social safety nets or similar welfare programs. The economies have to reopen, and that means funding the vaccines, and rolling out the vaccines. So what can Africa do for itself? We have now seen in a very dramatic way the link between health and the economy. We are now determined, going forward, to increase health financing through domestic resources. This will be challenging, given the narrow fiscal base, but the African Union is taking the necessary exercise with the President of Rwanda leading via the ALM initiative. The second thing we want to do is to strengthen our capacity for preparedness for surveillance of pandemics by strengthening Africa CDC, which has been very decisive in this crisis. The third thing we're determined to do in the medium term is to manufacture a whole range of therapeutic equipment, supplies, and of course, vaccines. This may not happen in every country, but we're confident the Africa Continental Free Trade Area will be instrumental. Finally, what can we do together with the United States? The most important form of support the USA can do now is to support the issuance of the special drawing rights and their reallocation or recycling some of those to the countries who need them. Treasury Secretary Yellen's letter to G20 was a highly welcome one, where it signaled support for about $650 billion equal to SDRs. If we can together marshal the support of the reallocation or recycling of an ambitious amount, that would be a historic and decisive decision. I would go a long way to provide low-income African countries with means to purchase vaccines, rebuild their economies, support structural reforms, and return our economies to growth. The decision on the special drawing rights will be under discussion in the spring meeting of the IMF and the World Bank. We're looking forward to support of Congress to this very important decision. I think this would be the most important decision taken this year to help low-income countries without enough fiscal room for stimulus to help them purchase vaccines, roll out vaccines, and recover their economies. Africa is not asking for charity, but equity and solidarity. Both the USA and Africa can overcome this crisis together. I thank you for your time and your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Tom.
Thank you, Honorable Chairman Bass and Ranking Member Smith and distinguished members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I thank you for your time today, and it's an honor to share my observations of the COVID pandemic impacts affecting Africa. Serving as the U.S. ambassador in Rome to the UN agencies and along with our staff at UN Rome, we played an important role supporting the World Food Program, where we supported the work in over 85 countries delivering humanitarian aid, most often in the midst of man-made conflict. We also had oversight over the Food and Agriculture Organization, where we worked to shape farm and food systems in over 140 countries to increase capacity and resiliency. Prior to my service as ambassador, I was a farmer for 45 years, and I will always be. Well, let's first understand the COVID-19 pandemic is responsible for a fourfold crisis in Africa. First, a health crisis, the victimization of frontline healthcare workers and a looming caseload and death tolls. Number two, a social crisis, the violation of human rights, the killing of citizens by security forces, and increased crime. This in turn exacerbates social inequalities, the breakdown of households, instances of social unrest, and general impoverishment. Number three, an economic crisis manifested by a decline in GDP and mass unemployment. Fourth, and lastly, a political crisis, implementation of measures that may not be appropriate for Africa, discrimination of refugees and immigrants, evacuation of citizens to their home countries, resulting in distrust of political leaders and postponement of national elections and mounting cases of conflict and unrest. The COVID pandemic is indirectly impacting the ability of people to afford food. With nearly 350 million people now unemployed on the continent since the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020, people need income to have access to food. Further exacerbating the situation is the global income has dropped almost $5 trillion because of the pandemic, while food prices have risen, as they always do in famine situations, and they have climbed. Today, the global food prices are at a 6-year high, and the higher those prices go, the lower the purchasing power for the hungry and the World Food Program and the few people that they can feed. So for every 1% increase in hunger, mass forced migration increases by 2%. The World Food Program can't feed starving people if they can't find them, and the cost mushrooms. So what are the effects? Human trafficking, arms and illicit drug trade, and terrorist activities only increase. Governments on whom the World Food Program rely for funding have also shifted trillions of dollars of spending away from humanitarian aid and to development to economic stimulus for their own nation's economies. By the World Food Program's estimates, 30 million people are in hunger emergencies today. That's the population of New York plus LA plus Chicago plus Houston plus Phoenix plus my rural home county in Indiana. These folks are always hours or at the most days away from starvation and death. At the World Food Program, they have to serve the 270 million and try to keep the desperate 30 million alive, many of which are in Africa. So the World Food Program, under the leadership of Executive Director David Beasley of the United States, has been charged by the UN to keep people from sliding down from one category of hungry to the next. And E.D. Beasley has excelled, but he can't print money. The bottom line, the cost of addressing hunger in the world is a gap between rapidly rising humanitarian needs and falling global humanitarian spending. There are also other major elements driving hunger. It is the African farmers' lack of access to modern innovations, agricultural innovations to deal with climate change, pest, and many other challenges farmers face across Africa. You would ask, why has this occurred? The European Union continues their malign propaganda promoting the EU Green Deal and Farm to Fork Initiative across Africa, promoting food systems that are an indulgence of the rich, indefensible scientifically, and indefensible morally. The EU's promotion of this food policy is a crime against humanity, and we are seeing the impacts firsthand across Africa to the world's most vulnerable. It is time to break the continual cycle of poverty and subsistence living and the need for humanitarian aid and create economic opportunities that supports individuals, families, communities, and nations. We've also seen the African desert locust pass to biblical proportions across the Horn of Africa, consuming massive amounts of crops and food, putting upwards of 24 million people at extreme levels of food insecurity. And as one Sudanese civilian said to me on my last visit to Sudan in January of this year, I would much rather die of COVID than starvation. So for the US and the rest of the developed world, time is running out for us to have a positive impact on lives and livelihoods across Africa. I thank you for this opportunity to share my observations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our witnesses, and now we'll move into questions from members. And members, you know that you have 5 minutes for those questions. I will begin, and I'd like to ask my first question to Dr. Kenguson. I'm looking at what you reported and also what we've read in terms of the caseloads in Africa, and I wanted to know to what extent do you consider the official statistics an accurate reflection of actual COVID-19 caseloads and fatalities in Africa? And I know that the reporting from Tanzania, we all know, was certainly not accurate. Do you know if they are beginning to get on top of their reporting?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that very important question. As I indicated earlier, the official tally on the continent cumulatively is 4 million. However, we know that this is a fast-moving virus, and we started our testing late because we didn't have access to diagnostics. Recent studies, some of those conducted by the Africa CDC and some conducted by partners, including support from the US CDC in Nigeria, as I stated earlier, clearly showed that many more people have been infected. The unique characteristics of a pandemic is, one of the unique characteristics is that many people have been infected, young people, but they have not fallen sick or dying. Our recovery rate is above 90%. So what we are seeing and reporting is perhaps the tip of an iceberg. And that is why it's so important to roll out vaccines and vaccination very quickly across the continent, because we believe strongly that we are not seeing everything that we need to see. And what we are not seeing may come to hurt us in future. With respect to Tanzania, the government of Tanzania started off reporting the cases, and then at some point they stopped reporting. I think they stopped reporting when they had recorded 509 cases. And since then, we have not, as Africa's CDC, obtained further information. We are very encouraged in the last 2 weeks or so that the leadership of that country is beginning to acknowledge that there is COVID, and we want to use the opportunity to re-engage with Tanzania and offer assistance, technical assistance to support them. Thank you.
Thank you. And this question is to you and also to Kubaraka. The U.S. has committed $4 billion to the COVAX facility, but we know that there's an inadequate vaccine supply. During a press briefing last week, when asked if Africa can and should enhance its capacity to locally produce COVID-19 vaccines, you responded emphatically. In what ways do you think the U.S. can support the AU in expanding local production capacity in Africa and facilitating the technology transfer needed to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines?
Thank you, Chair. First thing we have to do is to ensure that we deal with the issue of intellectual property rights on the vaccines. At the moment, there are only 3 centers in Africa capable of providing the vaccines. There are 2 centers in South Africa, a small center in Senegal, Pasteur Institute, and I believe 1 or 2 in Egypt. So it is obvious that in the medium term, we have absolutely to increase the capacity of producing vaccines on the continent, but also many other therapeutic equipment. At the beginning of this crisis, it was very, very difficult to access even the testing equipment because these were being competed for by the wealthier countries. As my colleague John said, this is when the African Union set up the platform, and through the platform, we're able to acquire some of the testing equipment. Going forward, I think the action by the United States on intellectual property rights and through support to Africa CDC, through the support to the African Continental Free Trade Area, will be able to increase ability of the continent to produce vaccines and other therapeutic equipment. I should add, Chairperson, that part of the reason Africa has not been taken care of in the international community initiatives was the belief that Africa was not affected by the pandemic. So it was far behind in the curve. And that meant African institutions themselves had to take the lead, as my colleague John has been saying. And we're looking forward to working very closely with the United States on this. Again, beginning with what I said, with a positive decision on the special drawing rights in light of Treasury Secretary Yellen's letter to G20, which we found very, very highly welcome.
Thank you. Excuse me. And Ambassador Tom, you referenced your difference with the EU in terms of promotion of food policy, and I just wanted to know if you could tell me how that compares to our policy around Feed the Future.
Yes, Feed the Future has worked very well, but like I said, the European Union has been spreading propaganda across the continent of Africa. Their systems don't allow for hybrids or new genetics or crop care products, the use of fertilizer, the uses of machines and advanced agronomics. And because of that, their productivity is extremely low. It hasn't changed for nearly 3 decades. And this is why we have a food crisis that continues in Africa. This is why we pushed so hard in Rome to make sure our voice was heard, because we know firsthand what these technologies can do to improve the farmers' livelihoods in Africa. In fact, I'm working now with a group to go to Africa to start doing a little bit more of this development to create the economic opportunities for the people of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me go to the ranking member, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And like you, I read over and voted. Just a few questions, and I want to thank our distinguished witnesses for their testimony. I'm looking forward to reading it in more detail. I wonder if you could tell us how the health capacity building that was embedded in PEPFAR, including establishing labs, has helped during the COVID crisis. I would appreciate if you could speak more to the issue of locusts, which obviously have led to more people going hungry, more farmers losing their ability to till the land and produce crops. To Ambassador Tom, you worked extensively with the World Food Program and the UN Food and Ag Organization. And you spoke about WFP a moment ago. And I wonder how you would accept FAO's performance with respect to navigating the twin locust and COVID crisis as well. The impacts finally on all of the HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, the childhood vaccination support, particularly against the leading killers of children, the child survival revolution, as it's often called. How has COVID negatively impacted upon those initiatives? So yes, people disproportionately to the rest of the world have not gotten sick from the pandemic, although they're still getting sick, and it seems like there's a spike attributable to variants. But my question is, all the other efforts that have to be ongoing and robust as well to mitigate disease, how have they been impacted, or have they? If you could speak to that. And I would yield to our witnesses, maybe starting with Ambassador Tom first.
Thank you, Congressman Smith, for the question. So the Food and Agriculture Organization switched leadership about 1.5 years ago to Chinese Director Qu Dongzhu. Quite candidly, he's been doing an improving job at the Food and Agriculture Organization to create capacity and resilience. But in terms of the African desert locust response, this is a massive issue. And it started almost 2 years ago over in Pakistan, India, and it has spread across to Yemen and on into the Horn of Africa. And quite candidly, they didn't get to treating the locusts in time. So once that happened, these locusts continue to multiply. the tonnage that these would eat in a day's time was enough to feed oftentimes several million people. So the scope of this issue was very significant. And again, we paid a lot of attention to it at our embassy in Rome. We spent a lot of time working with the FAO, talking about what are they doing in their supply chains, what are they doing with digital technologies to go out and monitor where the insects are at and track and make sure that they know that the pesticides they're using are controlling the pest at the same time. Because this was a situation, it could have went from well, it's already at a $240 million cost, but it could easily go to a $3 or $3.5 billion humanitarian rescue effort if they are not controlled. The situation's continuing on. It's not over yet. They're still in Ethiopia, Eritrea. They're moving into Sudan, Kenya, a little bit into Uganda. But it is a significant issue, even in places like Somalia and Yemen, where, quite candidly, it's very difficult to have any access to treat the pest because of the conflict issues we have there. So the answer is FAO is improving in their response. But as we challenge them, we say to them, stop measuring success by how much you spend and measure it by the outcome. And this is what we continue to push the FAO to do during my time of serving as ambassador. Thank you, Congressman.
Would the other witnesses want to speak to healthcare capacity and these other issues, these very challenging concurrent issues that cannot be, put aside, especially when it comes to childhood health for HIV?
No.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Congressman, for that very pertinent question. First of all, I would say that the PEPFAR infrastructure and public health architecture that was put in place since early 2000 has been extremely instrumental in our fight against COVID on the continent, especially in the laboratory front. And I know what I'm talking about because I co-chaired the lab working group for PEPFAR for 12 years before leaving to come back to the continent. So we use actually that infrastructure to roll out testing. When this pandemic started, Congressman, in January, there was no laboratory in Africa that had the ability to test for COVID. In February, two countries, Senegal and South Africa, had the ability to test for COVID. And we used those two countries to bring in cohorts of countries in successions to ramp up testing. And when they went back, they used the infrastructure that PEPFAR had put in place to roll out testing aggressively so that by the end of March, all countries were able to test for COVID testing. I think that is really, truly remarkable. And I say that from really the knowledge of that infrastructure that was in place in three dimensions: the training ability that the infrastructure offered, the physical laboratories that were supported by PEPFAR, and then the surveillance that is monitoring for the virus, which we are built on as a backbone to respond. Second is the immunization programs. Our immunization programs for childhood immunizations will greatly be eroded because of COVID-19, no doubt, because children are not being taken to the immunization centers. Mothers are not going to the maternal childhood care that is required, and that clearly is going to be a challenge going forward.
Thank you. The children's time has expired.
If you could maybe at some point get back, Doctor, to the children, because it is important, and particularly as it relates to any response that we might have in terms of beefing it up. I've worked in the Child Survival Revolution for decades, and it's very disturbing that we are seeing a fall off and kids might get these other sicknesses.
Absolutely, no doubt about that. And of course, the impact on HIV/AIDS is going to be tremendous.
Thank you, Representative Smith. Dr. Kenguson, I wanted to talk a little bit about the reliability of some of the COVID cases that are being reported out of Africa. Do you know how reliable these COVID cases coming from Africa are?
Yes, I must say that we have set up what we call trusted travel systems just to make sure that the continent coordinates its ability to monitor those who travel with a COVID test. And I think as best as we can, I must say that we are doing our best to increase the quality assurance of these tests, and through that common platform, which we call in the Africa CDC Trusted Travel Platform, we continue to ensure that. However, I mean, Africa is a vast continent. We are still rolling that out, and it's not excluded that some mischievous characters will try to take advantage of the situation and introduce inappropriate COVID tests on the continent. But we are doing our best to ensure that we minimize that as much as possible through the trusted travel system.
I appreciate that. Are there any particular countries that you are concerned about regarding their ability to test and track cases?
Absolutely. Of course, Africa, as you know, Congresswoman, is very diverse in nature and also in its capacity and capabilities. But as I said earlier, all countries have the capacity to test for COVID now. The question is how to sustain that testing and roll the testing up into remote areas. But with the introduction of the rapid test, the antigen test, it is becoming easier to roll out testing into even remote areas of Africa, including in most countries.
How can the United States help with this? Do you see any role for us to play?
No, absolutely. United States, as I indicated in my submission, Congresswoman, can support efforts in a partnership in 3 areas, just like you did for PEPFAR. I think that would be extremely a game changer. Africa has always been grateful when the United States leadership in global health has been in the nature of what you did with PEPFAR in 3 areas. One is expanding diagnostics and maintaining the diagnostics. Second area is the vaccines, rollout of vaccine, as my colleague, Dr. Kubaraka stated. We need vaccines. We also need vaccinations. Vaccines without vaccination will not save lives. And thirdly, supporting our efforts in the area of continental manufacturing of some of these vaccines and diagnostics. Health security hinges on 3 things: the ability for people to have a diagnostics, the ability of the people to have the vaccines, and the ability of the people to have drugs. If Africa the partnership supports these efforts, we believe that our health security needs will begin to be met.
Yeah, really appreciate that. And I just wanted to conclude with something that I like to do as someone who was born on the continent. I realize that oftentimes we don't celebrate enough of the successes of the continent, and we spend a lot of time talking about what is wrong and not enough time talking about what is right. So I wanted to celebrate some of the successes that some of the countries are having, like Senegal. I also know that countries like Rwanda, Ghana, South Africa are using some novel technology approach to the pandemic. Can you explain why some of these countries have had such a success in responding to the pandemic and what the rest of the world can learn from them?
And absolutely. That's a very good point, Congressman. Senegal, for example, you mentioned. My friend and colleague, Amadou Saad, was one of the first. I remember he was in DR Congo supporting that country in the Ebola response. And I called him up on Sunday. One Sunday, I said, Amadou, where are you? He said he was in DR. So I said, please, you have to get back to Senegal so that you open up your lab at the Institute Pasteur for us to bring people in for training. I did. He cut short that trip, went back to Senegal, and we started bringing in 16 set of countries to Senegal for training. They further developed a rapid test that they have been using, and they are really forward-leaning in terms of using community approaches in supporting the response. South Africa used the experience that they have built on HIV, fighting HIV for many years using community workers and community healthcare workers to really do contact tracing. I think that is something that we should actually treasure and use in subsequent pandemics. Kind of innovations have been coming from Africa, and that is helping those countries. And those countries in West Africa, like Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. If you look at their COVID numbers, they are low because they just came out from the the Ebola crisis in 2014, and are still very, very aware of how to do contact tracing using community as a driver there. So there are many lessons that we have learned because of their experience in fighting other diseases, including HIV, Ebola, and yellow fever.
Yeah, really appreciate it. I now yield time to Representative Bear.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'll make a statement. I applaud the Biden administration for their funding of the COVAX facility and the initial vaccinations, but certainly want to express my desire as a physician as the U.S. domestic population starts to get vaccinated and with the doses that we have, I think I would echo the sentiment that previously was stated that we have to participate and get vaccine to Africa and the rest of the world as well directly, because until we vaccinate the entire world, we will not be done with this pandemic. And the urgency of doing this certainly is, these new variants that are showing up. Let me ask a question to Dr. Kenguson, the director of the CDC in Africa. With COVID, with the lockdowns, with, certainly we've seen the impact of COVID, but could you comment on other communicable diseases, whether it's malaria, HIV, TB, other vaccination efforts? I do have a worry that with the focus on COVID, we may see a worsening and a resurgence of some of these other communicable diseases that we've been fighting. And I'd love to get a sense from the CDC, Africa CDC perspective, what's happening on the continent.
Congressman, that is really an excellent question, because we are currently doing studies to understand the amount of excess deaths that will result because of in HIV, TB, and malaria that will result because of COVID. That is, people that are going to die because they cannot go to the clinics and get their drugs. They cannot go to the clinics and get tested because of all of that. The UNAIDS projects that up to about 200,000 excess deaths may occur, not because of the COVID infection, but due to COVID infection, where it's disrupting services delivery across several countries. We are making significant gains in the fight against HIV, thanks to programs like PEPFAR, Global Fund, and others, but this is going to really set us back by so many years if we are not careful. Absolutely no doubt. I've been in public health for 32 years, and I know exactly how this pandemic tends to disrupt already challenging situations like the HIV, TB, and malaria. And lastly, immunization programs. Absolutely no doubt that they are going to be severely challenged, because the global supply system is so integrated and interconnected. When you start having lack of supplies that are required for COVID-19 response, they affect other immunization programs across the board. So I think that is an area that we are looking at very, very carefully. And lastly, the maternal childhood programs have actually suffered so much because of the COVID, because women are afraid to go to the clinics to get maternal childhood.
Great,
John,
thanks. Yes, please, go ahead. Please add.
Yeah, thank you, Congressperson. The progress we have made over the last 30 years in Africa on HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis was at risk because of COVID. After all, there are many more people now dying of malaria and tuberculosis than COVID. And that's why I want to express my thanks to Congress for the recent decision to provide additional funding to the Global Fund through the recovery program, so that the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis can secure those gains on those three diseases and use its competencies to help countries cope with COVID. I do want to recognize the US Congress for that decision, which has enabled the Global Fund to be able to protect some of the gains of the last 30 years on those diseases. Thank you.
You're welcome. And certainly we've seen how quickly science has moved to create efficient and safe vaccines much faster than I would have expected had you asked me a year ago. Would we have 3, 4 safe and effective vaccines against COVID? Hopefully we can take this effort and renew our investments in R&D and come up with vaccines that we've been working on to try to address malaria and tuberculosis, and really redouble our efforts to address these other infectious diseases that we know kill hundreds of thousands of people a year, and relieve the suffering. So again, my hope is as we deal with this pandemic, we build the infrastructure to help us deal with other diseases that inflict the continent, but also to recognize the next pandemic. And I will yield back.
Thank you. I think we've exhausted the first round of questions, and we'll move to the second round in case there are some members that want to ask further questions. I have a couple of quick questions, and then we'll pass it on to others who get in queue. Dr. Kubaraka, I wanted to ask you about the economic aspect of the COVID crisis. Do you think the United States should be supporting debt relief, debt cancellation, and the issuance of special drawing rights through IMF?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Those are very important questions. And the answer is yes. From the very beginning, 2 decisions were seen as critical to enable African countries minimize damage of COVID, economically speaking. The first one was to do a debt moratorium, which was to delay the payment of debt savings for those countries who wanted more fiscal space instead of paying the debt. That has helped a number of countries to provide them with resources to be able to pay for COVID-related expenditures. However, the initiative has been hampered somewhat by the fact that private lenders did not participate, and also a number of multilateral organizations did not participate. If they had participated, the DSSI, as they call it, the moratorium, would have provided greater benefits. But anyhow, it has been very helpful to a number of countries. The request now is that it is extended at the end of 2021, and I'm hoping the United States can support that. On the special drawing rights, the letter by the Treasury Secretary, Yellen, is a very significant one, because we have been making this proposal from the month of April, that in the same way as during the global financial crisis under the Obama administration, the IMF was able to issue 10 times the number of SDRs which were available, from $21 billion to $210 billion. The problem was that a lot of those SDRs went to wealthy countries who don't need them. The proposal now on the table is to issue $650 billion, but then recycle them to countries who actually need them by a mechanism we are yet to discuss. That mechanism requires the support of the United States, because the decision at the IMF requires a supermajority of 85%, which means the USC has a veto. Now, since the Treasury Secretary has indicated support, it's an important matter for US Congress, US administration, to push this at the next spring meetings. It will provide countries with reserves for economic needs. It will provide them economic space to buy vaccines, but also to return Africa to growth. I cannot imagine 2 more important decisions in the economic space than those 2 from the United States. Thank you.
What impact would this have on the economic crisis that the continent is facing?
So let me, in this way, during the financial crisis, Africa was expected to be the continent to suffer the most. It did not, because economic reforms in the previous years had provided enough economic buffers to be able to respond to the crisis. Not everywhere, in many countries. That were low, Our countries were able to cope with the financial crisis, but that weakened the economic buffers. So by the time the crisis came, the economic buffers were much weaker. And therefore, although we did not suffer from pandemic as much as other parts of the world, the measures taken to deal with the pandemic had been damaging economically, because 70% of jobs in Africa come from the informal sector. 50% of GDP is from the informal sector. So prolonged lockdowns, curfews, disruption of travel has impacted, probably we estimate a year in the neighborhood of $360 billion. Now, that is a huge cost. But you now have to walk back to families, businesses, large and small, people who live in shanty towns, to imagine the drama, what that means, because we don't have the safety nets to do social transfers, which in many countries they have. Secondly, as wealthy countries are pulled out in huge stimuluses, $17 trillion of stimuluses in the global north. Here in the global south, we don't have that economic space. So that is why the SDRs would be the equivalent of the stimuluses you are rolling out in America in the recovery program. European countries have rolled. That is the importance of this.
Appreciate that. Thank you. I now yield 5 minutes to Representative Phillips.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. I've got a large Ethiopian diaspora in my community. They are gravely concerned, as all of us are, relative to circumstances in Ethiopia, especially as so many tens of thousands of refugees are fleeing the country, being hosted in refugee camps in Sudan. And now as tensions between Sudan and Ethiopia grow, relocation efforts are underway. And my question is for you, Dr. Kubaraka. I'd like to learn about how refugee populations are being impacted by COVID-19 and how they are being prioritized for vaccinations.
Thank you, sir. I think to the question of refugees, we should add that of internally displaced persons. I chair the UN panel set up by Secretary Guterres to look at how to provide the resilience to IDPs in the Sahel, in the Horn, in different parts of Africa. You know, in this COVID, we cannot have islands of people not vaccinated. This is what Dr. John was saying. So we have to vaccinate 60% of our population, including those in the IDPs. We have to get to them. In terms of economic support, there absolutely has to be a mechanism in which social transfers, support to small businesses, support to households, support to communities, as rich countries have done, to reach all citizens of the country, including those in IDPs and the refugees. I want to insist on IDPs, because on the refugees, at least there is an international convention which covers them, i.e. people who have crossed the border of their country. But the IDPs are within their own countries. That is placed within their own countries. And therefore the focus to get attention to them, whether it is support for homesteaders, support is food, get medicine to them, get vaccines, is as critical as other citizens as well.
Thank you, sir. And I'd like to continue my line of questioning with you too, relative to something terribly important to me and all of us, which is faith in government and disinformation. As you've surely seen, Afrobarometer did some surveying not long ago, October through last year through January this year, that indicated only 3 in 10 citizens, I think it was 31% in West African countries, say they trust their government just somewhat or a lot to ensure that vaccines are safe. 60% of respondents said they're unlikely to receive a vaccination, even if the government says it is safe. So please tell us, what is the role of disinformation right now playing in how people are looking at vaccinations?
Can I ask you a question differently, Congressman? As your colleague Ilhan Omar was saying, this time around, actually, Africa's done much better than many parts of the world. We have got many things right, including building trust between citizens and the government. I do think Congresswoman was right, that probably there are lessons to be learned from Africa for even wealthier countries on how you create that bonds of trust during moments of crisis. So we still have challenges, But I do believe that in this crisis of COVID, all of us, rich countries, less wealthy countries, African countries, countries in the global north, we have a lot to learn together. I do believe that there's nothing specific about Africa which has happened this time around, which I can call specifically Africa. There are lessons to be learned about how do citizens and governments deal with crises of this nature, which know no borders. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I do believe that
Well, sir,
Congresswoman.
if I can, we only have a minute left. I would like to reclaim some time, but my question is really relative to disinformation specifically. And you know, my belief is it does exist. You know, do you believe it's an issue relative to people's faith in being vaccinated? And if so, you know, who are the malign actors who are propagating disinformation, and what is their objective?
I think disinformation of vaccines is global.
Yeah.
It's not limited to Africa. And it is important that vaccine hesitancy is something all of us deal with together in Europe, in the US, in Africa. My colleague John Kenguson is here, he may answer this question, but I do believe that vaccine hesitancy is a global problem. It's not specific an African problem. But maybe, John, you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, we just very quickly, in 30 seconds, Congressman, we recently, as Africa CDC, conducted a large-scale study across 15 countries in Africa. That included a sample size of more than 15,000 in 15 countries. And we found out that the rate of acceptance of vaccines will range from 60% to 95%, 60% in DRC to 95% in Ethiopia. So we are very encouraged with that that finding so far. And we did that very closely with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Thank you.
No, thank you, sir. Thank you, Doctor. I know my time's run out, but that, you know, those numbers were much more promising than the ones I saw from the Afrobarometer survey of not too long ago. So thank you both, gentlemen. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you all to that point of clarification. Misinformation in regards to vaccines is global. I think there's often a misunderstanding that there's something specific to Africa that it's not, and most Africans, at least to most studies have shown, do take vaccinations and are vaccinated at actually much higher rates than other ones if they do have access to vaccinations. I will now yield 5 minutes to Representative Kim.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Chairwoman, and then Mr. Ranking Member. I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. I want to continue on the line of questioning on vaccine distribution, and I would like to direct this to Mr. Kenguson. As the United States plans to provide $4 billion to multilateral organizations like Gavi and COVAX, how are those institutions working to ensure an equitable distribution of vaccines around the world? And what other countries are contributing to these mechanisms? And how is the U.S. Ensuring appropriate burden sharing? If I may, let me just ask a further question. Can you explain the impact COVID-19 has had on some African countries over the past year as compared to other viral disease outbreaks? And how are we weighing the allocation of treatment based on different regional disease outbreaks?
Thank you, Representative Kim. I must say that the Africa continue to be very appreciative of the Covet facility and the contribution of the United States into that. I mean, that we have always we require to fight this pandemic, given the enormity and how unprecedented it is. We believe that other countries in Europe are contributing. Many countries, Germany and many, France, and all contributing in this initiative as well. About 2 weeks ago, myself and Dr. Donna Kubaraka had a privilege to be invited to attend a meeting of the head of states with the president of France. That was before and after the G7, and they all continue to pledge their commitment to the COVID facility. So we see that as truly a sign of solidarity and cooperation and coordination that will be required to meet our vaccine needs. However, I must say, Representative Kim, that a COVAX facility, excuse me, is going to only enable Africa to achieve 20% of its vaccine needs. And as Dr. Kubaraka stated, we know that we have to vaccinate in excess of 60% in order to get rid of COVID from Africa. If we do not get rid of COVID from Africa, it becomes a threat everywhere in the world. That is for sure. Given the mutants, the new viruses that are emerging. So COVAX is going to enable us, and especially with the support of the United States, to get to 30%. It is a wish that that number, with the contribution and the leadership of the United States, increase that number that Africa will get. That is from about 20% to a little bit more higher, so that we achieve our continental goal of getting rid of COVID across the continent. COVID has been more disruptive than any virus that I think of in my 30 years career, because it is extremely.
I'm going to reclaim my time so I can talk about the food security, if you don't mind. You know, there is emergency food needs have doubled from 135 million to 270 million in 2020. And some have suggested food insecurity may have a larger global impact than the COVID-19. So as we look at second and tertiary impacts moving forward, where should food security rank on US priorities on the continent? And what resources do our relevant agencies need to meet that challenge? Mr. Tan?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so, I worked with Executive Director Beasley very closely. And as I said, he's been doing a remarkable job to work with the resources that we've had. Starting out last March, they knew immediately that they needed to change their posture and how they delivered food aid. In fact, they increased over 700 flights a month, moving food and personal protective gear around the world. Well, this comes at a big cost. And it's like I said, at the same time, when economies are collapsing. Right now, the World Food Program is predicting they need an additional $5 billion over what they have pledged at this time. $5 billion. And it can't be just the United States. We need to have other developed countries step up and support the World Food Program. So unless we get there, I'm worried about us feeding the 270 million, let alone the 30 million, but there's a total of over 690 million are hungry around the world. This is a lingering crisis that we need to solve, and we need help now, not just from the United States, but from around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just finish up with one last question. Continuing off my last question, while lockdowns have in many ways effectively stamped the spread of COVID-19 in developed countries, we have seen over the past year that lockdowns have severely impacted food security in a number of African nations. So in order to combat the spread of COVID-19, is there an alternative approach to lockdowns in order to ensure food security in impoverished areas?
Well, your time,
I don't know if I can answer with that.
Excuse me, your time has expired. So I'm going to ask if the witness could answer very briefly, because I need to go on to Sarah Jacobs.
Yes, thank you. So people, obviously in a lot of these developing nations are always needing to go out and grow their own crops. So when you have lockdowns, they can't go out and access their food. And if they do go out to try to access their food, they're coming into contact with other people. That is probably the biggest issue that we see, let alone their movement as they migrate into other areas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sarah Jacobs?
I yield back.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thanks to all of our witnesses for this very informative panel. My first question is for Dr. Kubaraka and Dr. Kenguson. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the kinds of investments that African health systems have had previous to COVID-19 that have helped them stem the spread of COVID-19. I, for one, worked on Ebola and Zika and a number of other public health crises, and what those investment models can show us for what we need to be investing in Africa, but also across the world in order to better be able to prevent future pandemic threats.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I would like to answer your question in two parts. Number one, what we are doing on health financing, because we realize that the speed at which we are going to our targets of $100 per person in terms of health financing now has to be faster. COVID has cost us about $10 per person. That is, if a country was at $30 per person in health financing, now it is at $20 at a time when economies are shrinking. But there is a program in the African Union led by the president of Rwanda, which is increase domestic resources for the health sector. But it is not simply about increasing domestic health resources. It's about better spending the money. It's about value for money. It is about sustainability. So where should we put our money? We should put our money exactly what universal health coverage says we should. Community health workers, leverage technology, simple insurance, community insurance. Those are things which provide strong primary healthcare systems, which are a robust way of dealing with normal diseases and pandemics. So where I would put my money now is exactly where the ALM is putting the money. That is, build robust primary healthcare systems, increase domestic financing, because remember, a lot of the gains over the last 30 years in infant mortality, in pandemics, has been largely funded by international funding, PEPFAR, the Global Fund, Gavi. And our aim is to ensure that over time, we pick up our ability to fund those programs so that they can be sustainable in the future. So the support we're asking for is support with our programs of domestic health financing, support on sustainability, focus on doable things, health workers, community health workers, community health insurance, leveraging technology. These things have delivered enormously, including here in my own country. Thank you. But Dr. John, maybe you want to compliment me?
No, I think that is just brilliantly stated. I don't think I have any more to add. I think you touched on all the key areas.
Thank you. Then I will move on to my next question for Dr. Kubaraka. I wanted to ask about migration. From your experience and research, have you seen any decrease in migration between African countries as a result of COVID-19, and specifically the migratory route from the Sahel to North Africa? And do you know if UNHCR staffing at refugee camps has been affected by these changes in migration and any other secondary effects you've seen from the results of these migration patterns?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Let me make 3 points which are often not well known. A lot of African migration is within Africa. It's between African countries. So a lot of migrants, a lot of refugees who originate in Africa are within the continent of Africa. So it is some countries in Africa holding a huge burden of refugees or migrants from other countries. The share of migrants crossing the Mediterranean is proportional to those who actually don't leave the coast of the continent is huge. Now, we have to work with our European partners, of course, to try to ensure that these human beings are protected. But at the end of the day, I believe that focusing on what we are doing here on the continent in terms of economic cooperation, economic integration is the way to go. Now, have I seen evidence of fewer migrants going to Europe? I suspect that has happened because movements are restricted. In any case, economic opportunities in Europe are limited now. And also because of COVID, the movements will be far less than they were in the past. But I want to emphasize the point that many more migrants from Africa are within Africa, concentrated in a few countries than those who cross the Mediterranean, tragic as that may be.
Thank you. And my time has expired. So Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Jacobs. I do not believe that we have any more members present, and so I would just like to thank the witnesses for coming. And we do want to continue to talk to you, though, because we want to figure out how the U.S. can be more helpful. I think all of us have learned through this pandemic that it's one thing, it's great if we can get the virus under control in the United States, but until we get the virus under control in the entire world, none of us are going to be safe. We have seen that variants will pop up. We are all feeling good that there is better, not great, but better accessibility to vaccines here now. But again, if it is not stamped out in the world, we will need to continue to have different types of vaccines. So I want to thank the witnesses today, and at this point, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.